what finally brings down McCarthy was the great statement, have you no decency? Have you no sense of shame? And right now, I feel like there is no sense of decency or sense of shame with the Trump administration, whether it's domestically or internationally.
And welcome in. I'm Dave Trafford, and good of you to join us for this reboot of Now and Next. Now, it admittedly has been a few months, but we're back and we're ready to go. And the plan here is to publish weekly on all of our audio and our YouTube platforms. So you should also know we're also going to post key elements of interviews on my Substack. So that would be davetrafford.substack.com. Just search for me on Substack if you're there. And it'll include a little bit of commentary, written commentary, but also some of the video that we are producing for the sake of Now and Next and On the Ledge, by the way. All right. Now and Next, today we kick things off with Trump versus the world and Trump versus Minnesota. David Schultz is a professor of political science and an authority on the U.S. Constitution. He's teaching at Hamline University in Minnesota. And if that's not enough to keep him busy, he's also the editor-in-chief at the Minneapolis Times. So brings a pretty interesting perspective to the international and the domestic politics playing out these days in the United States. David, I don't know how you have time to even teach given everything that's going on. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a while since we had a chance to talk to one another.
And a lot has happened. And you know what? The pace at which it happens is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
When I reached out to you last week to talk to you, I was going to ask you literally and pointedly, did you think NATO was dead, given the antics of the president, if not even just a lame duck alliance? But based on what's played out this week in Davos, I'm thinking NATO may have asserted its power and authority in a rather unexpected way now that Trump seems to have done a dramatic about-face vis-a-vis Greenland. He's back down on the tariffs based on what he calls a framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region. Did NATO make Trump blink?
I think they did. I think they did make him blink because, he's been having a lot of, quote, success recently. We're going to call it qualified success. He basically has orchestrated what I call a quasi coup in Venezuela. I'm not sure what to really call it in terms of it. He got somebody out, but not completely out. He's been pushing lots of people around at this point in lots of countries. And finally, I think NATO pushed back and said that, listen, if you're going to play this game, we can also do the tariffs. We can also, send more troops to Greenland. And I think it was a combination of that, but something else also happened in the United States, which is the stock market crashed with what he was doing. And whenever the stock market crashes, that's what scares him, because what he likes to say is that the economy is doing really well under him. And so I think it's a combination of finally pushing back against the bully, not doing an appeasement, but also think of the playbook that Trump has. And let's take him back to his first term in office. When Trump basically renegotiated NAFTA, the new NAFTA deal, was essentially what? The same deal as before, but he put his gloss on it. Basically, what's the old, repainted or something. He didn't get anything out of this deal, but he's now claiming, I got all this great stuff. Isn't that a classic playbook? He creates a crisis, in this case, a real serious crisis, and then declares victory, and all his supporters at home say, look at what he's done. So kind of a long, convoluted answer. NATO pushed back. Is NATO as strong as it was before? I doubt it is, but NATO did push back.
Well, interesting you should bring up the trade deal. And of course, that's top of mind for us here in Canada in terms of the review that's coming up with Canada and Mexico. It's worth noting that was the best trade deal ever, and now he's trashed it, and we're facing all of these, crippling tariffs, et cetera, in his trade war. So, you never say never in terms of what he's putting out there, and vis-a-vis the framework of a future deal. Framework really isn't a deal. I mean, he talks about the framework of trade agreements with UK
Right.
and other countries. It's not really a formalized treaty, is it?
Mm-hmm. No, it is not. It's not a framework. It's I'm not sure what you would call it here. It's that maybe at some future point we can put more troops there. Maybe at some point we can have some mining deals and so forth. To me, it's like after he toppled Maduro in Venezuela and he said, we're going to have all these oil companies come in and extract the oil. And what was it? ExxonMobil came back and said, nah, we're not going to go down there. It's too risky. It's too costly, et cetera, like that. I don't think he really walks away with anything except saying something rhetorical. But doesn't this fit into sort of his narrative that goes back, 30 or 40 years? He likes to be the person who has the art of the deal, to claim that he's cut deals. What does he claim in his first year in office now? That he's solved 7 or 8 or 9 wars or something like that? I don't exactly see a peace trail, flowing from the White House at this point. So I don't really see much of anything that's come out of the Greenland, except the fact that he has really ticked off a lot of neighbors. And if I can go back to the Canada, for example, I mean, think about what he's done with Canada at this point, is that he's pushed Canada to a point where it's closer in terms of some deals to China now and to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I was going to say, Canada is in a much better negotiating position this coming year with the United States, because United States might not be as critical to Canada for trade as it once was. And so Trump may be losing a lot of his leverage with a lot of what he's doing, including his leverage over NATO too.
Well, it's interesting. Just before we came on here, the Icelandic or the Greenlandic, mistake. The Greenlandic Prime Minister Jens Fredrik Nielsen says, "I don't know what's concrete in this deal either." So there's a lot of unknown around it, and it really is interesting to see how at Davos, I thought it was interesting to point out that it would appear as though globalization is on life support if it didn't die at the World Economic Forum, which of course seems to get all the blame for globalization historically. And you point out Mark Carney's comments at Davos. It all suggests the old world order is a thing of the past. He says, our new approach rests on what he's calling, and he picked up from the president of Finland, values-based realism. The old order is not coming back. Nostalgia is not a strategy. The tone has changed here considerably in terms of the new world order, and it would appear as though the Americans are on the sidelines, not really participating.
You're exactly correct, in the sense in which part of what was essential to America's strength post-World War II was the fact that the U.S. was very much a global power, and involved with alliances across the world, whether they were NAFTA, whether they were Bretton Woods about economics, a whole bunch of different things at that point. And that was really the strength that the U.S. had in terms of, if I could use it here, the tentacles being everywhere. But this historic tendency of the U.S. to retreat back into its cocoon, which is part of what Trump is doing here, is actually making America weak again. It's And if we now are not trading with Canada, if we're cutting back with trade with other countries, if we're alienating a lot of our allies, what is it? Last week, I think the U.S. pulled out of about 50 international agreements or something. We're not as relevant as we used to be anymore. And that's only going to make America weaker. So this is, the whole politics of make America great again. I'm not sure if it's nostalgia, rose-colored glasses, halcyon, or just naivete, but he's restructuring the world in a way where the U.S. is less relevant.
Yeah, and it's almost a sin of omission in many respects. I mean, he's kind of standing back and letting things happen around him, as active as he appears to be. You talk about that isolationism, and there was a quote I saw in the New York Times from Xi Jinping saying, "Isolationism is like locking yourself in a dark room," and that's kind of where Trump seems to be right now. And everybody's paying attention, but nobody's listening. Is that fair to say?
It is. It's kind of, I like that quote. I was also going to say, it reminds me of, remember when we were little kids, we would like put our fingers in our ears and go, yeah, 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 if we didn't want to hear somebody say something. I mean, what's that, like the practice of a 4-year-old or something like that, And I sort of feel like this is the politics of a 4-year-old at this point, is that just because you lock yourself in a room doesn't mean the rest of the world doesn't exist. It basically means what? You've locked yourself in a room, and that's about it at this point. Yeah.
Well, again, we go back to this values-based realism, and you talk about, the Canadian relationship with China, and that has caused a lot of stir here politically and culturally in this part of the world with the new prime minister. But it's interesting to see where, Carney went to China and he got his deal to reduce the tariffs on canola and seafood exports into China in exchange for allowing more EVs into the country. That has upset our premier here in Ontario because that's the heart of the automotive industry.
Right.
But at the same time, you look at China now as being considered, ironically, the predictable partner. I mean, the Europeans are looking at them, at least in agreeing and committing to some kind of concept of rules-based international trade. This was a slow simmer, but this is all of a sudden at a boil in terms of China's opportunity here, no?
It is. I'm going to say Carney going to China is like Nixon going to China back in the 1970s. And think about it here, because, Nixon going to China back in the 70s was a way of trying to split or play China off of Russia, or the Soviet Union at that point, much in the same way that Mao was trying to figure out ways of playing the U.S. off the Soviet Union. And it was a smart strategy. Isn't this sort of, tell me what you think, isn't it sort of the smart thing now, is that Carney now gets to play China off the United States? I think that's an absolutely brilliant political move.
Well, and the same thing is happening to some degree in Europe, though. I mean, the Europeans are looking to China as well. So, China hasn't really been proactive here, but they have benefited from the antics of Trump, et cetera. I mean, there's a Cornell University, Eswar Prasad is quoted in the New York Times saying, China definitely wants to assume the mantle of being the adult in the room here, and it's just doing so quietly. But it will have a change. This will be the new world order, whether it's globalization or not. The whole perspective and lens on how we create resiliency in our own economies, culturally, vis-a-vis our sovereignty, all of these things have changed, and China now seems to be at the center of that.
It is. I'm almost wondering if we're talking about now globalization, but without the United States, as sort of one hypothesis here. The second is, and I probably have overquoted this, back in 1941, before the U.S. got involved in World War II, the American journalist Henry Luce wrote a famous piece called The American Century, and said that if we get involved in the war, which we need to get involved here and support our allies and stay involved afterwards, get involved like globally, we can create the American century, a world in our image. World War II is now what? We're now looking at what? It's over 80 years over at this point. And some people are saying maybe the American century is in its 80th year, and we're starting to enter what? The Chinese century at this point. This is certainly what the Chinese are thinking. I think Russia, Brazil, a lot of the other countries are thinking that what Trump is engaging in is sort of the politics of a declining power. And instead of Trump taking action to let's say truly reinvigorate, to keep involvement in the world, isn't he just sort of feeding into that growing irrelevance for the United States in terms of economic so far power? And at the same time, think about one of the other great powers that the United States had. It was cultural. It was what? It was how our values, Hollywood, television, impacted the rest of the world. I think the image of the United States now has been so severely damaged that we're losing that kind of cultural advantage that we once had too.
Yeah, the end of the century, I was going to bring that up because you and I have talked about that a lot in the past. And if history doesn't repeat itself, it certainly rhymes. And when you look at how this is playing out vis-a-vis Greenland, the whole, U.S. presence in Greenland happened before they committed officially to going into and supporting the Second World War efforts. So that in and of itself seemed to be the opening for that American century, and this might be marking the end of it around what's gone on in Greenland. So, I don't want to get too philosophical or poetic about it, but it looks like that's where we're going.
It does look like that's where we're going at this point. Now, let's layer one other thing into here, which we haven't talked about here, which was, what was it, the email or whatever it was last week, that when Trump sort of confessed and said, well, the reason why I'm mad, reason why I'm worried about, I want Greenland, because I'm not getting the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
That's the little boy saying, if I don't get my way, I'm going to hold my breath.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's worth noting, if those of you who haven't seen or heard the interview with the New York Times reporters in the Oval Office, I think it was last week, and one of the questions was around, why do you need Greenland? And he said, for psychological reasons. And then the reporter said, psychologically for the United States? No, psychologically for the president. It was going to help him. And I thought, okay, that was one of those underreported issues. But to your point, that's what's kind of driving so much of this agenda. Before we go, I do want to get, you are at the center of the storm vis-a-vis what's been going on in Minnesota. And we're not talking about the World Junior Hockey Championships. Right. We're certainly talking about far more serious issues around ICE's presence there, the Border Patrol there. The headlines, I don't have to tell you, are staggering. The idea that all of this almost has been forgotten 2 weeks ago, since Renee Good was shot and killed by an ICE agent. Since then, things have escalated. Where does this movie end, or how does it end?
It's funny. I was just talking to a couple of my friends about this, and I don't know how it ends at this point. First off, to give you kind of an inside feel here, it feels like a civil war is here, or we're on the verge of it, in which we're being occupied by an occupying force at this point. Remember, we're also the place 6 years ago, just about, where George Floyd was murdered. And after George Floyd was murdered, we had the horrible riots and destruction. Everybody I talk to is like worried that if somebody steps on the wrong twig, things are going to go wrong, are just going to escalate out of control. And they did. We had somebody killed at this point, but we're all worried it's going to really get worse. And no one can figure out, like, when's the surge going to end, for example? In other cities, the surge has lasted a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks. Here, I don't see any end game. And in fact, I see especially Trump and ICE, Kristi Noem, digging in even harder at this point. It's hard to figure out at this point. I started teaching on Wednesday at Hamline. All the schools are back in session now, the colleges and universities. And we're all taking this like one day at a time, thinking, are we going to have to go back online? What's going to happen at this point? I've got students who are asking me at this point, saying that, can we go online because I'm Hispanic or I'm Somali or so forth like that. I'm afraid to go to school. So tense, anger, worry. I'm just trying to think of all the adjectives that I can come up with at this point that people are experiencing at this point.
Yeah, even on the street, that tension and anxiety is palpable just from this distance, watching what's going on. But you combine that with federal investigations into your mayor, into the governor, and the fraud scandal is a real issue that needs to be tackled for sure. But you conflate all of this into what's happening on the streets. And, again, I ask, well, how does the movie end? And as you say, you don't know how, but what's at the root of it? Maybe is the better question.
The root of it, I think it's also personal. Everything is personal with Trump. Remember, our governor ran as the vice president against him. And in the same way that he's gone after, that is, Trump has gone after former FBI Director Comey, gone after the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James. Everything is intensely personal for him. And I think that's what's going on here also, too. He has personalized this about Waltz and is going to make the state pay, much in the same way that he personalized, Greenland, the Nobel Peace Prize, fill in the blank, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the week ain't over.
I know. We're only into Thursday, folks. I don't know about you, but it's like I get up in the morning. I'm an early riser, about 5:30 in the morning. The first thing I do is I check my cell phone for news to see, all right, what happened and what's going to be the news cycle in terms of for the day. And it is a constant twisting and changing. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a fiction writer, but if I were, this would be such a convoluted plot in terms of all the twists that are occurring that you can't quite conclude that the butler did it at the end. I don't know who did it. Yeah.
Well, I suggested to somebody yesterday, Oxford Dictionary actually adds words to their dictionary every year because they gain new meaning, right? It occurs to me, David, that we need to eliminate the words unthinkable and unimaginable because now, given what's going on, they have no meaning anymore. You can't say anything is unthinkable based on what's going on in the Trump White House.
It is. And I also think, to harken back to an era before I was born, I think clearly before you were born, the McCarthy hearings, where what finally brings down McCarthy was the great statement, have you no decency? Have you no sense of shame? Right. And right now, I feel like there is no sense of decency or sense of shame with the Trump administration, whether it's domestically or internationally. I mean, going back to the Davos speech, if you listen to it, he slashed at just about every ally that the United States had. Where's the decency?
Well, I was listening to David Frum's podcast last week, and he qualified it, comparing him to Nixon, and he said, well, Nixon was a president who had a scandal. Trump is a scandal with a presidency. So
that's a great distinction. That's a great distinction. Yeah.
Really interesting. David Schultz, I know you've got a jam-packed calendar, and I appreciate you taking time to talk to us today. It's always good to connect, and we'll have to do it more often. Thank you, my friend.
Okay, one last thing before we go here. Rangers and Maple Leafs.
Well, I'm wearing the Maple Leaf hat. I'm suffering for you for the Rangers because they're looking up at everybody in that conference of theirs.
I know. I tell you, these are still dark days for Rangers fans, and it's looking a little bit better for Toronto.
Yeah, well, we're hoping in for a wild card spot there, but we'll get there. David, thank you, and go Rangers on your behalf.
All right. Talk to you later. Bye.
All right, that'll do it for this episode of Now and Next. Be sure to share this episode with your network, anybody you think might be interested in what we have to say here. And, of course, you can like or follow the podcast wherever you listen or you watch. By all means, feel free to leave us a comment. Got a question? Happy to entertain them, and we'll address them in upcoming episodes. So thanks again for joining us. I'm Dave Trafford, and this is Now and Next.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.